Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today in front of this group, and especially to be your last speaker. As Latrice pointed out, I don't know why that, I'm not sure that came out the way I intended, but I would like to end a little bit early because I know some of you have a drive back, and I think, thank you very much. I don't know if I'll get any other applause, so I really appreciate that. And then I'll take questions, but I will not spend the night to answer questions, but I will answer them. I'll stay in here for as long as you have questions. Let's see. Sunshine Law. I know a lot of you have already been briefed on the Sunshine Law by your county attorneys, but the legislature, as Herb Thiele mentioned, thought it was so important that elected constitutional officers get a briefing on the Sunshine Law that they mandated it by state law. And I think one of the reasons why they did that is because of the severe consequences for a violation of the Sunshine Law. Persons who violate the Sunshine Law can be subject to criminal penalties, and occasionally that has been the course of action by our local state attorneys. Did Herb Thiele show you the booking photograph, which is quite frightening, of a county commissioner behind bars, in part because of a violation of the Sunshine Law? So if anything would scare people to not violating the Sunshine Law, it should be seeing a picture of that county commissioner at obviously a low point of his career. So why did this county commissioner get into so much trouble with the Sunshine Law? In part, of course, it's obviously intent, but the other thing is, I think people still find it hard to believe how broad our Sunshine Law is compared to those in other states. Because many people like to come to Florida, they will come from other states which have weak versions of our open meetings law, and they may try to influence you and other people on a commission to disregard the open meetings law because it only applies, they will say, in certain select circumstances. As you can see, that is absolutely not the case. It's very broad in scope. In fact, over the years, I've had people in Congress, that's a scary thought, call me, usually they're in the minority party when they call, saying that they want more sunshine in the federal government because they're totally out of the process. I used to spend a lot of time with these people, and then I realized it was a waste of my time because they were not interested. And so then when they call me, I say two things. The first is what I just told you. There are criminal penalties for violating this law in Florida. And the second thing is what is on the slide in front of you. That is that the Sunshine Law applies to any gathering, whether formal or informal, whether on an agenda or not, of two or more members of the same board to discuss some matter which will foreseeably come before that board for action. So you can see how broad that is. It's almost like, how broad is it? Two or more. There are no private discussions of public business in Florida. Sometimes people will say, ask this question, see how you would answer it. What about an organizational session? Your very first meeting. Does the Sunshine Law apply? Yes. What about a meeting to elect officers? Does it apply? Yes. Here's a tougher one. You all are answering these questions far too easily for someone like me. It's like you already know all this stuff. The other question sometimes people ask is, suppose the commission has already voted on an issue. In other words, it's done. Does the Sunshine Law apply there? Say, for example, two county commissioners would like to discuss the fact that they disagreed about the issue and they'd like to talk it over so they can be more collegial. Most of your county attorneys will say the Sunshine Law can apply there, even though the item is not scheduled at this time before the county commission. It could be. or there could be other factors that you don't know, which would result in the Sunshine Law being applied. So even if something has already been voted on, the better course of action is to consider the Sunshine Law applicable, because that broad standard and the consequences for violating the Sunshine Law are simply too great. 3 basic requirements of the Sunshine Law. The first one we've already discussed. Meetings of public boards or commissions must be open to the public, unless, of course, the legislature has created an exemption. The legislature can create exemptions from the Sunshine Law. Secondly, reasonable notice of the meetings must be given. Typically, the notice requirement is something that your staff deals with. The Sunshine Law does not specify exactly how much or where notice must be provided. It simply says reasonable notice. It's not necessary, for example, to buy an ad in the newspaper. You simply have to provide notice to the press public in a way that will enable them to have a reasonable opportunity to attend. So how do you determine when notice is adequate? I always recommend putting yourself in the position of a judge who is looking at whether or not you provided adequate notice of a meeting. For example, if you're like the city council that provided an hour-and-a-half notice of a meeting they held to hire a lobbyist, the judge would say, that's not reasonable. Is there an emergency there? But suppose, for example, the city commission was dealing with an enormous weather situation. There had been a hurricane that had gone through the city, and city facilities were in bad shape. And then the city commission decides to have an emergency meeting to make sure that there are facilities available to help the local residents. In that case, an hour-and-a-half might be reasonable notice. You can see that in trying to make this determination, you're evaluating the nature of the situation. Is it an emergency? Balancing that against the amount of notice that you're providing. Many local counties have specific notice requirements that apply in certain situations, and in that case you would apply those. Typically the staff knows what all of them are, and you can rely on them to make sure that your meetings are adequately noticed. We have standard notice guidelines or suggestions in the Government in the Sunshine Manual, which is available at our website. I'll provide that a little bit later. And you can always look at those to see whether or not they could be of interest to you. The third requirement of the Sunshine Law is that minutes be kept. Now, this is an interesting component to me, that when the Sunshine Law was passed in the late 60s, they added this minutes component, because there are many citizens out there that want to have a much broader connotation of what that term means than what minutes really are. Minutes are not a transcript of the meeting. Minutes are not a summary of every single comment that a member of the public makes. Members of the public are dismayed to find that the minutes don't even mention that they spoke to the board. Is that legal? Yeah, you don't have to write down everything. Now, as a policy matter, you may choose to have very detailed minutes, but in our opinions, minutes are a brief summary of what took place. The county commission met on this date, and typically they will include the motions that were made, seconded, and passed, and who moved them, etc. So it can be fairly brief. It really provides a record to the public that the county commission met at a certain date and basically what they did. What else to add, as I said, is basically a question of policy. Some boards have very detailed minutes, others do not. Advisory boards are subject to the Sunshine Law, and the courts say there is no lesser standard for these advisory boards. In other words, they don't get to have less stringent sunshine law requirements simply because they're advisory boards. The reason why advisory boards, whether appointed by the county commission as a whole, whether created by the legislature, or even whether appointed by a single individual, are subject to the sunshine law is because the courts early on said that it was the entire decision-making process that the sunshine law should apply to. These decisions came out in the early 1970s. Some may remember around the time of the Watergate hearings, where there was this tremendous groundswell of support for democratic processes and institutions. In other words, the whole idea of secrecy in government was something that at that point in time there was a lot of national attention focused on that, and our Florida Supreme Court was one of those that really gave a very broad construction of the sunshine law at that time, and one of the things they did was include advisory boards within the scope of the sunshine law. The impact that this has, I think, upon you is that you may be thinking as leadership, sometimes it might be a good idea to have an advisory committee look at a particular issue. Many times that is a good idea. But people who advocate that have to keep in mind that this advisory committee, regardless of whether they want to be or not, is subject to the sunshine law. They can be charged with sunshine law violations if they fail to comply, and their meetings must be noticed and minutes kept, just like for meetings of the county commission. Now, the courts have said that there is an exception from the requirements of the sunshine law for so-called fact-finding advisory committees. So sometimes boards will create advisory committees and say, your only function is fact-finding, i.e. information gathering that they provide to you. Do you think it's a good idea to create a so-called fact-finding committee with the goal of having the sunshine law not apply? That is, I agree with those of you that are saying not a good idea. Why? Because typically people who are appointed to committees will not be listening intently to everything that is explained to them. All they will hear is, we don't have to comply with the sunshine law. They won't hear the sunshine law only doesn't apply if you are fact-finding and information gathering. So what do you think they do? This has happened over and over. They're not listening, and what they do is say, well, we're more important than simply fact-finders. We're going to present recommendations and a course of action that we think the county should follow. What happens then? They should have complied with the sunshine law. They didn't, so there are all kinds of consequences. Sometimes that has meant that members of an advisory body have been prosecuted. More commonly, it means that somebody who disagrees with the finding of the advisory committee files suit to get their recommendations overturned and declared void by a court, and all their hard work for an entire year is called into question, invalidated under the sunshine law. So that consequence is so bad that in my view it's really important that advisory committees understand at the outset that they're subject to the sunshine law, that there's no lesser standard for them. Sometimes people think, well, you know, this particular advisory committee, what it's doing is not very important, so the sunshine law doesn't, you know, who cares, basically? People care. I know, you know, when I say this to elected public officials, you all understand, I think, more than sometimes people do, how issues which may seem inconsequential to 99.9% of the public are of vast importance, almost sometimes to the point perhaps of an obsession to maybe 1%. These people sometimes get into these issues with advisory committees. One circumstance that I remember from years ago involved an advisory commission that was created by a city, and the sole function of the advisory committee was to provide recommendations to the city commission on what kind of flowers to place in the median of the city's main street. The advisory committee immediately broke into two factions. One favored roses and one favored some other flower, azaleas, I think. Well, the two were arguing back and forth at the meeting, and the debate continued as the rose faction went to a local restaurant to privately debate and discuss strategy for defeating the other side. Unfortunately, someone from the other faction was seated in the booth right behind them and heard every word. So what do you think that person said? Just said, oh, well, you know, big deal. It's only flowers in the median. Who cares? That person did not do that. They went right to the local state attorney and filed a complaint alleging a violation of the Sunshine Law. And I learned about this from the poor assistant state attorney who called me and said, the committee happened to be mostly female and I believe of a certain age, and he did not want to have to prosecute anyone. So it was agreed that instead, now the ladies might have preferred another option, but instead they had to undergo Sunshine Law training. They might have said, give me jail time, but they did not. So that just shows, though, how advisory committees can be subject to the same sort of problems sometimes that any human being can face, and why it's so important, regardless of the committee, to make sure that these requirements are understood. All right, here's something that usually gets a bad reaction from cities and counties, and I think Herb Thiele mentioned this morning. The legislature and courts not subject to the Sunshine Law. They have, though, undertaken Sunshine Law and ethics training. They have done that. There is a constitutional provision, I'm ignoring all comments, that provides access to legislative meetings, not as strict as the Sunshine Law. But if legislators are appointed to serve on a board that's subject to the Sunshine Law, the legislator members are subject to the Sunshine Law, just like the other board members. Staff meetings, I know we have staff here as well. Staff meetings not normally subject to the Sunshine Law. In order to be subject to the Sunshine Law, you have to have a collegial board created by law or by the commission or by a single individual. But staff committees can become subject to the Sunshine Law if they are deemed to be part of the decision-making process. So this is something I won't spend a lot of time on here, but this issue can sometimes occur. For example, if the county commission were to create a committee composed of staff to meet to make recommendations to the county on the budget, the county commission creates a committee of staff, maybe some citizens are on there too, to make recommendations, short list, for example, of priorities for the county commission. When this happens, it's not sufficient to just say, well, the Sunshine Law doesn't apply to staff. In something like this, where the Sunshine Law could apply, a court could say, or your county attorney could say, that in this case you've created a committee composed of staff that's more or less stepping outside its staff function and is providing recommendations to you on the budget. Sometimes this is done when a county commission or a city council, perhaps wants to avoid public airing of budget issues. They just say, well, we'll create this committee of staff and we'll have them meet privately. You can see where this is the type of situation that can result in sunshine law issues. Typically, you see this issue coming up with staff committees potentially subject to the sunshine law in purchasing, personnel, or budgetary types of issues. Because there's no hard and fast standard, the best advice I can give you for proceeding in the future is to, if you're thinking about creating a committee composed of staff, then discuss this with your county attorney with regard to any possible sunshine law ramifications. It's always better to discuss the sunshine law before you create the committee rather than to have a situation where you have a personnel committee that's recommended firing various individuals, and those individuals then raise questions about whether or not the sunshine law has been violated. Acting before you create the committee is always a good idea. The sunshine law has a few exceptions, but all of these are created by the legislature. In other words, boards have no authority to create for themselves an exemption from the sunshine law. This can be sometimes a problem if you get someone on your board who is from out of state that might think, for example, that under Robert's Rules of Order, you can go into executive session. What impact does Robert's Rules of Order have with regard to the sunshine law? Zero. It means nothing. Only the sunshine law itself controls when boards meet in public and when they can meet in private. The fact that Robert's Rules of Order has provisions in there regarding executive session does not authorize a board to exempt itself from the sunshine law. There's also, and this is something that the students that I teach at FSU have so much difficulty with this concept, and that is that in other states, if you're discussing a confidential matter or discussing confidential records in particular, or something that's very private, boards in other states have the ability to close a meeting to discuss a confidential record. In Florida, no such authority exists. Even if the records are exempt under the public records law, that does not give a board the authority to close a meeting. Only the legislature can pass a statute authorizing a board to close a meeting under the sunshine law. And this provision is right in the Public Records Act, where there's a provision that says simply because a record is exempt from Chapter 119 does not imply an exemption from the sunshine law. You can just imagine how difficult that has sometimes been in practice, particularly for boards like school boards, who have a variety of confidentiality statutes that apply to student records. But until the legislature passed an exemption from the sunshine law for student expulsion hearings, they had to hold the meetings open to the public at the same time while they were dealing with confidential records. So I think sometimes that leads me to think here in Florida how dedicated boards like yours are to doing the right thing, no matter how difficult, practically speaking, it can be to accomplish. Instead of like in other states where boards, if they want to close the doors to the meeting room, they just shoo everyone out and do that. You go to the legislature and make the argument that an exemption is needed from the sunshine law. And if the legislature agrees and it's signed into law by the governor, then that's the basis for allowing a meeting to be closed. Sometimes I wish if I could only discuss one slide in today's world, it would be this one. because if there is any one thing these days that gets boards into trouble, it's using technology to communicate with another board member, and for whatever reason, thinking that this is authorized under the Sunshine Law, that somehow there's an exception that would allow board members, even though they can't meet face-to-face, that there's something that would allow them to discuss board business via email, text messages, Facebook, the telephone, Twitter. There is no exception from the Sunshine Law that permits board members to use these technologies to discuss public business. And in fact, one issue that I think sometimes board members don't think about is the fact that the Public Records Law, which we'll get to later, is not surprisingly just as broad as the Sunshine Law. So text messages relating to public business are subject to disclosure under the Public Records Law and obtained under the Public Records Law, and if they show two board members have been talking to each other, then that's a violation of the Sunshine Law. So I really, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail when we get into the public records section, but I am gratified to see how aggressively the county attorneys will be looking at this issue. And in fact, one county attorney tells an example of how there was a county commission meeting going on, and a county staffer was presenting a particularly boring summary of a project that he had been working on. Now, perhaps understandably, maybe some of the county commissioners were getting bored. I know, apparently it happened. So one county commissioner, the county attorney is dismayed to see, he sees him, the county commissioner, with his BlackBerry going like this for the film and looking over at another county commissioner. He then sees the county commissioner pick up his BlackBerry and look at it and look at the other county commissioner. Then the county attorney is horrified to see the second county commissioner look at the assistant county attorney. So the county commissioner is then, with his BlackBerry, looking at one and then sending a message to the county attorney, assistant county attorney. So the county attorney is horrified. It's his own staff that's being brought into this. At this point, the county attorney, I think appropriately, takes action to make sure to talk to his staff and say, what was this message about? It turned out that the county commissioners apparently had been playing brick breaker and had sent their high score. Now this shows several things. Well, it shows that they were communicating with each other. It's a good opportunity to go over the requirements of the Sunshine Law. Did the county commissioners violate the Sunshine Law by playing brick breaker while the staff member was making a presentation? No. What about when they sent the high score from one to the other? They communicated. Not a violation, because they were just doing their brick breaker, at least to date. The game brick breaker, I should point out for those of you that don't know it, it's not dealing with construction practices. That's personal, not a violation of the Sunshine Law. Did the county attorney do the right thing? Absolutely. Because this is the kind of thing, if you see one commissioner sending something to another commissioner, it's why some local governments have banned use of the technology. Because for one thing, it avoids Sunshine Law issues, And for another, suppose these county commissioners had been doing this while a member of the public has come to talk to the county commission about an issue that's important to them. How does that look when two people are doing this? So but it shows something in our modern world that probably wouldn't have been an issue maybe even 5 years ago. But it shows a lot about the Sunshine Law. Now, what should you do if, regardless of whether you're at the dais, another county commissioner sends you an email about government business? So this commissioner has sent an email about government business. Of course, do not reply. I mean, one thing that's critical is there is no violation of the Sunshine Law, as the slide points out, for a one-way communication between, now I'm not saying that's a good idea, but the strict legal requirement is it doesn't violate the Sunshine Law for someone to send a one-way written communication about public business as long as two things are done. There is no response and the email is kept as a public record. So I would suggest 3 things if that ever happens to you. A member of the public, another commissioner sends an email to you about public business. Don't respond. Send a copy of the email to the county administration office so it can be kept as a public record, and call the county attorney to give a briefing to that commissioner about the Sunshine Law. These 3 things, the same would apply with a text message or anything else. Sometimes I notice that people are reluctant to accuse somebody of something, and nobody is saying that you would have to file a complaint with the state attorney, for example. But taking these 3 steps, if anyone sends you a written communication, will ensure that you are not targeted with a Sunshine Law issue, in my opinion. With telephone conversations, suppose somebody calls up, this happens more often than you might think, and starts and just says anything about public business. What should you do? Hang up the phone and then call the county attorney. Sometimes, this is where being polite, in my judgment, it's not the time to just be polite. That person, if they are talking to you and they're a county commissioner and they're talking about county business, it's time to hang up the phone. The reason why I mention this is the case that Herb points out, the county commissioner's booking photograph. One thing that county commissioner did that was interesting to me was he had a conversation about redistricting on the telephone, clearly a violation of the Sunshine Law, between 2 commissioners, and a third, so clearly they violated the Sunshine Law. But what's interesting is there was a third person on the line, the supervisor of elections. So the supervisor of elections, though, is the supervisor subject to the Sunshine Law? No. But the supervisor says something like, you know, doesn't this conversation violate the Sunshine Law? And the commissioners, not perhaps surprisingly, one of them said, no, we don't care. We're going to talk about this. So even though in this situation, the supervisor was not charged with violating the Sunshine Law, it does point out that if she had just hung up the phone, then she would not have been a witness, would not have had her testimony taken. In other words, I pointed out because she had some latitude in the sense that she couldn't be charged with a violation of the Sunshine Law. But it was hard for her to hang up the phone. So it's almost like everybody has to think in advance, what would you do if another commissioner, hopefully that will never happen, starts talking to you about county business or writing to you about county business. If you know right now what you're going to do, then, and if you, you could even talk to the county attorney about what you should do, then I think you won't be in the situation that supervisor was. I'm sure that many months after the fact, she kept thinking, I wish I had just hung up the phone. So that's, with all of the news reports, particularly in this area affecting county commissioners, I think it's important to get that kind of thought in mind. What would you do or not do? Early on, when the Sunshine Law was first passed, you might think, and the courts came out with this 2 or more standard. As you know, if you've looked at the actual language of the Sunshine Law, it doesn't say 2 or more members. That's what the courts have said for 40 years. It just says all meetings. The courts have defined meeting to be any gathering of 2 or more members. That's the standard. Early on, boards had a choice, and I'm talking back in the early 70s. They could have just said, well, the courts have said it's any gathering of 2 or more members, so that's the standard, so it's a broad statute, it's designed for the public benefit, so be it. Do you think that they did that? No. Early on, boards thought that they could avoid the Sunshine Law by using staff as a liaison. The theory being there aren't 2 board members talking to each other, there's only 1. And so, for example, in Leon County, people told me that in the early 70s, if the school board had to deal with a confidential matter, they would go to a local restaurant, which some of you might remember in Tallahassee. It used to be called Garcia's. Great food near Leon High School on Tennessee Street. And it had little booths, very dark. And each school board member would sit in their own individual booth, and then the superintendent would go around from booth to booth to booth, and and based on the communications that he heard, he could take action accordingly. So that method was used in a variety of different places in Florida until the court said, look, the Sunshine Law does not apply to an individual board member. And so individual board members can feel free to talk to anyone they want to, except another board member. And of course, the court said, as a rule, board members should feel free to talk to their staff. So it doesn't violate the Sunshine Law for a board member to talk, for example, to the sheriff, another elected constitutional officer, or to another city commissioner, or to the county manager. I mean, that would be ridiculous if an individual commissioner couldn't talk to his or her own staff. But the court said that if the commissioner uses staff as a liaison to circumvent the Sunshine Law, for example, asking staff to poll all the other board members and let him know how everyone feels, or to say to another board member, pass along, please tell Commissioner Jones I'm strongly in favor of her proposal, but I need to hear what Commissioner Brown says. So these kinds of things the courts have said are wrong. And the way they decided that as a legal matter is they said that a meeting between an individual board member where staff is being used as a liaison to poll other board members, they called that a de facto meeting, something like from a legal standpoint. It's not a, but for Sunshine Law purposes, it's just as problematic as if 2 commissioners met directly with each other. Board members are not prohibited from using written ballots to cast a vote as long as the votes are made openly at a public meeting and the name of the person who voted and his or her selection are written on the ballot. And the ballots can be reviewed under the Public Records Law. Sometimes people want to use written ballots, but they only have a result. They don't have the name of the person that voted, and then if somebody asks to see the ballots, they're not provided to them. So written ballots are okay as long as they're not a secret ballot. Boards can adopt rules and policies to ensure orderly conduct of meetings, but they cannot ban videotaping, tape recording, or photography. Those things are authorized under the Sunshine Law. You can, for example, require that a video camera be on a tripod, but if somebody in the audience, for example, or even another commissioner wants to record what's going on or take pictures with their cell phones, these things are authorized under the public records or under the Sunshine Law. I remember once a few years ago, there was a city commission that was meeting, and one of the commissioners spotted her rival in the audience, and she had, you can tell this was some time ago, she had a tape recorder plugged in to the side of the wall, and this commissioner got so annoyed that she came down from the dais and went over and pulled the plug out of the tape recorder, which meant the entire commission had to have Sunshine Law training. So let that be a warning to all. Yeah, let people tape record. It doesn't violate the unlawful intercept law that we have here in Florida because these are public meetings. So the provisions in Florida law that prohibit someone from surreptitiously tape recording or privately tape recording someone else do not apply to public meetings. Board meetings should be held in places that are open to the public, not in private homes or country clubs or other places that limit or restrict the public from attending. It's not a good idea to have public meetings in restaurants because members of the public may feel reluctant to come in. They may feel like they have to purchase a meal, and also it can be very hard to hear if you're not right at the table. So ideally, public meetings held in public buildings. Open to the public means open to all, and this includes employees and vendors if the meeting is public. Now, there is a recent legislative exemption for certain purchasing meetings, but if there's no exemption for a particular meeting, then open to the public. Sometimes boards want to keep the meeting open to the public, but they may wish to exclude employees, for example. Cannot be done. Open to the public means open to all, although obviously if employees want to attend a meeting, they're required to comply with whatever leave policies that you have. You just can't say, for example, we are excluding employees from this meeting because we're discussing potential terminations. That would be bad. Significant Sunshine Law legislation. Probably the most significant one, and I know that all of you are now working with the public participation measure that the legislature passed last year. It went into effect on October 1st. Most, if not all, I really don't know of any county commissions that were prohibiting the public from addressing a meeting. So as far as I can see, in talking to some of the county attorneys, this provision really did not change much in the area of, yes? It does not. It does not. The question was, and yes, this was, I'm really, if I had known that was going to be the question, then I would have taken action, right. But they do allow public participation, but this new statute is a direct mandate to all entities subject to the Sunshine Law. But there are several crucial factors that are involved with it. First, there are some exceptions for, say, ceremonial proclamations or for meetings that are exempt by law. Boards can adopt reasonable rules and policies designed to protect order and decorum, and this includes time limits, for example, and measures designed to see whether or not one person can speak for a faction or group. I think it shows a lot of work by those involved with this proposal. I believe that the League of Cities and Association of Counties were asked for their input, and I think that for purposes of providing an adequate forum for public participation, it looks as though the legislature recognized that it was necessary to have some boundaries. The other significant feature of this provision is it is not a part of the Sunshine Law. The Sunshine Law is section 286.011, and as you can see, this statute has its own number, 286.0114. And the reason that's significant is because the same penalties that would accrue for a violation of the Sunshine Law do not apply here. It is not a part of the Sunshine Law. It's its own statute. And the legislature was particularly, they made a particular point of adding a provision that says that if a board violates this section, it doesn't make the entire process void, which is, as you know, we'll get to this as well, a provision or consequence if the Sunshine Law is violated. What the remedy here for people who feel that this statute is not being complied with is to go to court and get an injunction to more or less have a judge require the board to provide an opportunity for public participation. I see the biggest impact of this new provision will really be when boards create advisory committees. Many times, advisory committee members are not given adequate instruction on the Sunshine Law, and this particular provision that they have to provide public participation at some point is not, in my view, adequately stressed. So that's one way that you can ensure that, and in many cases, of course, the county attorneys have already done this, but it is something to keep in mind that this provision is something that applies to any entity subject to the Sunshine Law. So it's important that it go to the advisory committees as well. We've discussed this already, that a knowing violation of the Sunshine Law can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor of the second degree by the state attorney. Sometimes people think that this is a matter that the Ethics Commission has jurisdiction over, and they do not. The Attorney General's office, no jurisdiction there. An unintentional violation can be prosecuted as a non-criminal infraction. And sometimes you see this done. One of the last examples that I remember seeing was where a city commission, and the city attorney later took great pains to come to me at a seminar and say he knew nothing about this. But the city commission, based on advice from the city manager, decided that it was going to hear a proposal from the sheriff about providing law enforcement services to the community, which is something that is typically done. Many times you see that in South Florida. And the meeting was going to take place at a private breakfast meeting at a local restaurant. Now, what's interesting about this situation is the city manager told the city commissioners, don't talk to each other, but you can listen to the sheriff make a presentation. Now, if you had been asked by this city commissioner, do you think that violates the Sunshine Law for us all to sit at a restaurant and hear from the sheriff about providing law enforcement? Can we just say we didn't talk to each other? Right. The court absolutely disregarded that argument, and the state attorney did prosecute them for violating the Sunshine Law as a non-criminal infraction, so they all paid a fine. But what's interesting about the non-criminal infraction and about the facts in this case is it really shows something that I overheard a commissioner say, I won't identify you, saying, you can't do trainings on common sense and stupidity. Well, I would have to agree with that comment, because when you think about it, here are these city commissioners. This is a hugely controversial issue in the community. who's going to provide law enforcement. There are very few things that people care about less than being safe in their homes and in their communities. So for the city commission to think that it could have a private briefing at a restaurant and rely solely on the city manager to say that's okay, at some point you have to think, does that make sense? I think I'm going to call the city attorney and get a second opinion on that. So sometimes these kind of situations, the court said that in this case, there was a meeting that should have been held in compliance with the Sunshine Law, and said that the sheriff was really a common facilitator going to this liaison kind of thing, and they should have held it open to the public. This shows that sometimes when you have a situation like this, where you're thinking big law enforcement, controversial issue, private meeting in a restaurant, why didn't they have this at town hall, where the public could see what was going on? The court may be finding a way, would you not agree, to say, the court just being reluctant to say, well, there's nothing I can do about this, I guess it was legal. Now, does this mean that board members cannot go to candidate forums and things like that that are reasonably open to the public? They can do that. They can do something like that that's reasonably open to the public. But the court, a candidate forum, as long as they don't talk to each other. But the courts on this fact-finding principle are really reluctant to say that members of a board could do something like what these city commissioners did. And that's where I think just asking yourself, does this sound right, is probably the right thing to do, and then listening to your city attorney. If a board violates the Sunshine Law, then the courts say that the action is void ab initio. Based on this standard, contracts have been invalidated, real property acquisitions have been invalidated, hirings invalidated, firings invalidated. The reasoning is that the violation of the Sunshine Law makes the action void ab initio. But the courts have said, and perhaps some of you have been in this situation, typically this occurs where there's an inadvertent violation of the Sunshine Law. The person in charge of providing notice has forgotten, for example, to do the notice. Sometimes that happens. Then the Sunshine Law defect, the courts say, can be cured by a full open proceeding in the sunshine. Now, this is not just something like boards tried this early on, where the city attorney comes in and says, well, we failed to comply with the notice requirement last week when we took action on the budget, so now I need a motion to approve the budget at this open public meeting. That's not good enough. It has to be a full, it's sort of like you have to go through a little bit of pain if one of these inadvertent violations takes place. A full open hearing, you have to go back over it. In other words, a couple hours of debate, analysis, all the more reason to make sure within your especially your notice provisions, within your staff, that there's a fail-safe procedure. A lot of boards, I recommend that you have 2 people with oversight over notice. So if the person, for example, that's primarily in charge of it, for whatever reason, has some sort of emergency and forgets to provide notice, you have somebody, typically the county administrator, who just confirms that all of the notice has been online, or perhaps goes online, at the designated time 1 week before the county commission meeting to make sure that it's still there. I know that when I was an aide in the governor's office, we used to do that for the meetings of the governor and cabinet. We used to go through and just make sure that all those agencies that come before the governor and cabinet had properly noticed their meetings. I wouldn't have wanted to be the one to tell the governor or a cabinet member, sorry, we have to go back over the Department of Revenue agenda because they didn't notice the meeting. We don't want to go there. The whole idea of it is horrifying to me, even after all this time. So we'll move on into the public records law. Not surprisingly, just as broad as the Sunshine Law. I think that with regard to the public records law, it's a little bit easier for elected commissioners because most of the county records are maintained by the staff. For example, the actual records that the county uses in its functioning, the staff is responsible for keeping all of them. So it's almost like county commissioners, if you choose not to send or receive anything except through the county server, you generally don't have to worry about the public records law, because if there's a public records request for all of your emails, somebody in county administration is dealing with them. But when do you have to worry about it? You got that phone, you start sending text messages, or you start receiving or sending emails on those private phones, and you're not sending them to the server, then that's where you're going to have public records issues. Because look at this definition, it's even in blue, of public record. You can see that there are three components to this very broad definition. All documents, letters, maps, books. You can tell that this definition was written in the late 60s. And they're trying in the late 60s to encompass everything that might be used to record information. And they go to photographs, films, sound recordings. Then in the 90s, the legislature gets with it, the technological revolution, and they add data processing or other material regardless of physical form, characteristics, or means of transmission. This component covers text messages, tweets, emails, if anybody ever actually sends a written letter, all of these things equally within the definition of public record. Particularly, and I know for some of you you've heard it all before, but some people still out there had difficulty with the fact that text messages are public records based on their content. It's the content that determines whether or not any record is subject to the Public Records Act, as seen in the next component, if it's made or received pursuant to law or ordinance or in connection with the transaction of official business. That's the determining factor as to whether any communication sent by a public official is a public record, sent or received. Made or received pursuant to law or ordinance or in connection with the transaction of official business, the third component, by any agency. You can see from this definition that it doesn't matter where the information is located, i.e. whether it's on a government computer or a private computer. It's the content, the subject matter that is going to control. So I would throw it out to you, if you get an email on your private email account on the computer that you have at your home and it relates to county business, what should you do with it? Correct. Or a text message, what should you do with it? Same thing. Because what happens sometimes is, particularly these days with text messages, people can get into difficulty because suppose they're up at the dais with a BlackBerry or with a smartphone and somebody in the audience is sending them a message about county business. People in the audience will see this. They will see, for example, someone in the audience typing something, and then their eyes will go up to the dais, sort of like my previous example, but more sinister, and they're not playing Brick Breaker. that commissioner is reading this and perhaps saying something, you know, at the meeting in response to what he or she has received. So if these are what prompt citizens many times to file complaints with the state attorney, for example, if the commissioner has not kept the text message, there will be a public records request for it. If the commissioner can't produce it, the person may go to the state attorney and file a complaint. I was talking with a group of public information officers recently, and I was talking at 8 o'clock in the morning, if you can imagine anything worse than to hear about these topics at 8 in the morning, and I could tell I was losing the attention of the audience. And I said, I see that some of you are not believing me, because they had told me that, for example, their bosses, one was a PIO for a police department, and this person said, well, my boss, the police chief, sends anything that he doesn't want made public via a text message to my private phone. And I said, well, of course that's illegal if it relates to public business, and I could tell people weren't paying attention, so I said, go on your laptops, everyone in the class, and Google the word TextGate and see what comes up and what can happen when this issue is overlooked at the local level, because failure to maintain text messages that are sent or received in the course of public business or whatever other technology the world comes up with, tweets, Instagrams, for example, if they relate to public business, they must be kept as public records in accordance with a retention schedule based on the content. In other words, what used to happen is public officials, particularly with text messages, would say, well, we don't know how to keep them, or that's the phone company's responsibility. These are not good excuses. They have to be kept in accordance with a retention schedule. So my suggestion would be, I wouldn't know how to keep text messages, for example, that are sent to me in accordance with a retention schedule. So what I do is send them to my office so they are on the government server, and tell people, please don't send me text messages, or I have them resend them as an email. So all of these opportunities are in place. Even if you're like me, a technological dinosaur, my kids, even when they were 6 and 7, knew more than I do now, and they're even easier to use. I mean, I feel stupid with that stuff, but even I can do that because I don't ever want to have a situation where I can't produce a text message. So that is, if anything stays with people today, I hope that message comes across. Two things when they said this. First of all, they said there's no draft exception. If material has been circulated, it doesn't matter that it's not in final form. Still a public record, a draft document that, and many times, that's what people most want to see. They don't want to see the formal, sanitized, makes sense version. They want to see the person who's kind of a loose cannon, what they think that makes some stupid proposal. That's what they want to see. So drafts are often requested under the public records law. If, however, someone is making personal notes for their own personal use, I don't recommend doing this, but you can ask your attorney about under what circumstances your own personal notes may be outside the scope of the public records law. I can't answer that for you today. All I can tell you is it's clear that once it leaves your desk and goes to another person, regardless of whether that person opens it or not, like, in other words, once you send that email to someone, then you've created a public record. But only exempt unless the legislature, if the legislature has said so. But something that you write a note to yourself, then that may be a different matter depending on the circumstances. The scope of the Public Records Act, it's very broad, of course. Only the legislature can create an exemption. There's no stupid exemption. There's no I wish I hadn't said it exemption. There's no right of privacy exemption. We have a provision in our Constitution that creates a right of privacy, but it specifically does not apply to public records. So as all of you have already realized, I know, the important time to think about when is something a public record is before you write it, or before if someone says, I want to send you something, but I want it confidential. What do we have to tell these people? You might want it confidential, but somebody can see it, unless the legislature's created an exemption. So before the material comes to you is when, or you create it, is when you think about whether the public records law. We've already discussed at length the application of the public records law to email messages, texts, Facebook postings. The important thing with these technologies is, I think, really twofold, because first, once these technologies are used to create or receive messages that form public records, they must be disclosed in response to a public records request. But the other significant aspect that people overlooked was that they, just like paper records, have to be retained in accordance with the retention schedules developed by the Department of State. These schedules vary depending on the type of records. Some records don't need to be kept that long. For example, based on if they are considered to be inconsequential, they may not be required to be kept longer than needed, which is a very short period of time. Others, like personnel records, it's a matter of years. So the type of technology does not answer that question. What is in there determines how long you keep it. And there's a records manager for every county that should be able to answer those questions for you about how long you keep particular records that you have. And of course, as I've indicated, I think a myriad of times, just sending all the records you make or receive in the course of official business to the county administrators means you don't have to worry about these issues. If they have them, they can produce them and keep them in accordance with the applicable schedules. When agencies are providing public records, they sometimes think that they have some discretion to sort of establish reasonableness criteria. This is not true. The public records law states that every person who has custody of a record shall permit it to be inspected and copied by any person who desires to do so at any reasonable time, under reasonable conditions, and under supervision by the custodian. This very broad right of access, also in our Constitution, means that a person does not, as they do in other states, have to have a special purpose or special interest in order to access public records. Anyone can make a request for public records, and they can be anonymous, in the sense that an agency is not authorized to ask that person to produce ID or a driver's license as a condition to obtaining public records. Now, at this point, I have to point out, though, something that citizens will call me sometimes, and they'll say, I went into the county administration offices and I asked to see Commissioner Jones' travel records. And I found out later that the receptionist called Commissioner Jones and said that I was here to look at the records. And so she blew my cover, and this is illegal because I have the right to remain anonymous. Is this citizen correct? No. And here's the important distinction. The county cannot ask someone to identify themselves as a condition to receiving records. Similarly, if you want to call yourself Donald Duck, you can do so. Then the county says, here, Mr. Duck, are your records. But if the person at the desk knows that it's John Jones making the request, there's nothing that gives John Jones the right to be confidential. In other words, if somebody knows who they are, then they can say so. So the right to be anonymous, i.e. to not have the county ask you for identifying information, does not give a requester the right to be a confidential source. So is this clear to everyone? Because it is something that occurs. It is clear. The custodian is not authorized to refuse to provide public records based on a lack of specifics in the request. In other words, what this means is a person can come in and ask for every single record the county has. And sometimes a member of the audience has said, and they do. What should the county's response be in a case like this? Should they say, you are crazy, you're not getting every record that we have? Is that an appropriate? Right. I am getting a response from the audience saying that the county can tell a requester in that circumstance that it is not able to provide records for free, and that they will pass along the statutory charges. Generally, these types of requests are based on a lack of understanding of the volume of the records that you have. For example, someone may ask for all the records relating to arrests in the police department and think there are only about 15 because the police aren't doing anything. And instead, there's 150,000. So it may be that in dealing, when you work with staff on these requests, it may be helpful to contact people who make an extremely broad request, to just write back and say, you've asked in the ballpark of 150,000 records, and we have to pass along the statutory charges. Let us know if you'd like to change your request in any way. This way you're avoiding having your staff write back something like, yeah, you can get all the records we want. I need a check made out for $1 million. You know, this kind of thing sometimes doesn't make government look as responsive as it could be. Do you have to provide the records requested and then bill the person? Or can you bill the person first and then provide the records? The latter is correct. In other words, you can always negotiate fees first before you provide the records. So this is a real opportunity for the county staff to be working with the public to help them understand what the public records law requires, that the county can't shut down operations just to provide free records to one individual, and that it is really a cost recovery rather than a money-making operation by the county. If somebody comes to the county and says, I have asked for a copy of the minutes from 1975 county commission meeting, and I want it by 5 o'clock, what should the county's response be? Good luck is not the best answer. I think a more tactful response would be something like these. In other words, you are correct, good luck answerer. Implicit in your answer is that the Public Records Act does not contain a specific time limit for a response, nor is the requester allowed to say, or are you required to comply with their deadline. Instead, though, the amount of time that the agency has is the amount of time it takes to go get the record, review it for exempt material, and copy it if that's what they've asked for. So it's going to vary. If a large number of records are requested, it's going to take longer than if it's just a one-page letter that the county administrator just showed last night to the county commission. So under these circumstances, it makes sense to me not to debate these time limits or to give a flip answer like good luck. Instead, the response should be something like, we've got your records request. Because you've asked for something from 1975, it's probably going to take some time to get it, but as soon as we do, we'll provide it to you. See, no debate over how long it's taking. A person does not have to make their records request in writing or use any forms. If you think that your county administration office is requiring people to fill out forms or to put their request in writing, I recommend calling a halt to that practice. It's the clearest way to get a complaint to the state attorney is if somebody is imposing an illegal requirement like a records request has to be in writing. If an agency wants to make sure it's providing the right records to the person, the agency can make a written record. That sometimes is a good idea. You can also, if you think it can be done as a totally voluntary endeavor, you can have a form available if people want to use it. But I can guarantee you, just because people misunderstand, if that form doesn't say right at the top in bold letters, this is a voluntary form. If you want to use it, you can. If you don't, we will fill out your records request anyway. You have to do that for your people so they understand that it's completely voluntary, because they're just doing their job, trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing, but it's completely illegal in Florida to require a records requester to put their request in writing. An agency is not required to give out information or answer questions or create new records under the public records law. These are totally policy areas. In other words, for example, I got a call from the Tallahassee Utilities. We have a public utility in Tallahassee, and so therefore all the customer records are public, unless some home addresses may not be. So the person at the utilities department said, I've got someone at my window from a repossession company, and they want me to give them the address of a certain individual so they can go out and repossess the car. Does the public records law require the clerk to answer the company's question about where does a resident live? No, you all are exactly right. It does not require the government to answer questions like the one that was posed by the company. If the company asks for a copy of the last bill paid by this resident, does the clerk have to provide it? Yes. You can see the difference between the two. The public records law is a records law. Whether or not to answer questions, create new records, that's a policy decision that you, being the management authority within the county, determine. It might be, it really gets down to the policy question of how helpful or how much information do you want to give to the public. There may be things that you decide you want to answer by telephone. The important thing is sometimes people think they have a right under the public records law to have somebody answer questions. For example, why isn't the Acme Park getting more money than the Beta Park? If you want to answer that question, you can, but the public records law does not require you to provide that explanation. If you've got it written down somewhere, then that's the answer that you have to provide under the law. we've already discussed this. The mere fact that somebody has asked that a record be kept confidential does not give the government the authority to make it confidential. Only the legislature can create an exemption, and this is why so many counties have something on their website or on all emails saying something to the effect of, note, under the public records law, most communications, there might be an exemption, sent and received by public agencies are subject to disclosure under the public records law. I recommend using one of these because it provides so much assistance to members of the public who may send you something that's extraordinarily private that they obviously would not want to be made public. They know, based on your website, that if they send you something, it becomes a public record, unless the legislature has created an exemption. If an exemption, which following along the same lines, if a record is not provided, you have to cite the statute. I am always amazed when agencies just say, in response to a public records request, no, you can't have that. Or a response like security concerns. It has to be the exact statute that provides a basis for refusing to provide records. And that is something that, of course, the county attorney is in the best position to work with you as to whether or not a particular exemption applies. This is a complex discussion of confidential versus exempt records, which I know you'll want to look at in more detail when you get home. But for now, I think it's something, if you have questions about that, to go to your county attorney. It's the same with federal and state law. When I talk to attorneys about this issue, we get into all kinds of supremacy clause issues. I've already mentioned retention. Records have to be kept in accordance with these retention schedules. Even exempt or confidential records are maintained in accordance with a retention schedule. Significant legislation, significant to law enforcement, is some of the a provision that their names or spouses are confidential or are exempt under the same exemption for home addresses. And these are something that I think you can look at and discuss with your attorneys. Access, yes.
On an extraordinarily difficult, like the 1975 document, it takes a considerable amount of manpower.
Well, and I was thinking you might not even have one going back that far.
We do.
Yes.
And I've got to pay a staff member an hour and a half to dig it out, and I charge that expense to the requester.
The question is, if you have to, in order to produce the document, you would have to pay somebody overtime. Can you pass overtime along to the requester? The answer is no. But on the other hand, there's nothing in the public records law that requires you to have employees work overtime.
Don't say overtime, regular staff time. During the day, it takes a couple hours.
Oh, an hour and a half. Oh, if the, let's get to the next slide. If a request is so extensive as to require extensive labor or IT resources, the statute allows you to pass that cost along. It's called a special service charge. But what's critical about this is that agencies have a policy or something that tells the public and the agency when you're going to consider a request extensive. And typically, that is done by time. In other words, an agency may say, if it takes more than a half hour, then we are going to charge the labor of the lowest paid person capable of doing the work, their salary and benefits. You can charge both. So in your case, when you say an hour and a half, typically most agency policies would start that charge at that level. In the Attorney General's office, though, of course, we have the gold standard to us. We don't charge for labor until it's 2 hours. But It's discretionary with every agency. But the important thing is you want to have it clear by some policy that if a request takes more than an hour of staff time, we're going to charge that. So that for every request, you're charging everybody the same. In other words, Mrs. Jones, who's sort of a thorn in everyone's side at making constant requests, is charged the same as someone else. So, but that is what the legislature was sympathetic to this about 20 years ago and did authorize the special service charge. Otherwise, it's 15 cents a page, makes sense, or actual cost if it's something like you put something onto a disk. You can require a deposit in advance, but negotiate all of this so that everyone is clear on the fees. The fees should be paid, if you like, before the work is done. If someone disagrees with your asserted exemption, or even worse, the agency has not responded, they can bring a civil action. In addition, there are criminal penalties for a willful failure to comply with the public records law. If an agency is on the losing side of a public records action, then they have to pay the attorney's fees of the person who successfully prevailed in the lawsuit. This to me is extremely important because even if the agency had a very good excuse for not providing the records, some excuses have been we had an incompetent clerk. Another excuse has been I didn't know that the text messages had to be retained. Something like this. No matter what the excuse is, if the judge rules against you, you have to pay the attorney's fees of the other side. You lose, you pay. Here's additional, on that good note, here's additional information that you can use. And also, I'm going to give you my email address so you can send me any questions that you might have. It is pat.gleason, Gleason, at myfloridalegal.com. Thank you so, and now we'll have questions for those of you who wish to stay and ask questions. Yes.
Going back to the Sunshine Law, when a clerk of court sits as an ex officio member of court, does he follow the Sunshine Law too? Since he can comment in meetings even though he doesn't vote, can he talk to commissioners outside the room or to his time?
Well, that's an excellent question. The question is, what is the status of the clerk of court as far as the Sunshine Law is concerned? The clerk of court under the statutes, and it may even be in the Constitution, is an ex officio clerk to the Board of County Commissioners. So in my view, they're not a member of the county commission. They're not the same as the elected county commissioners, but the legislature deciding that in our state, in addition to the clerk serving as part of the judicial branch, they are also the clerk to the Board of County Commissioners, but not a county commissioner. Yes, any more questions? I feel like people are being so polite and hanging around. I'd like if you, thank you.